John, it seems to me that we're in the middle of a layer. What is this?
We are delve. This side used to connect to that side and everything in between. So there's a lot of rock that's been removed in here.
Yeah.
And this is the Weber Sandstone, but down in Arizona in Grand Canyon, they call it the Coconino Sandstone. So the same layer, and we're standing in the middle of it.
You spent a lot of time studying this layer.
I did. It extends from California through Arizona, here through Utah and Wyoming, all the way up to the Dakotas.
Well, we've talked a lot about the deformation of those layers, the soft bending,
Right.
and so forth, but this is something different. This is something cut out these layers. What's going on?
You know, one of the things that we want to help people understand is how the Earth got its shape.
Mm-hmm.
And as a flood geologist, I think a lot of that shaping actually took place after the flood was over. There was certainly, you know, some erosion that happened as the floodwaters ran off. But as the mountains came up and as waters drained off, there was a tremendous amount of shaping. And geologists like to use a word called geomorphology. It means the shape of the Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can talk about shapes of mountain ranges or a shape of a mountain, the landscape around a volcano, a river valley, or things that glaciers do and so on. And all of those have particular shapes. And one of the things that we'd like to consider here is that we're in a slot canyon right here. So we can see these just towering walls around us. And we're down in this little valley. We're in the Uinta Mountains in a place called Sheep Creek Geological Loop. And we have this river running through back behind us. But, you know, I have doubts whether rivers can really cut canyons like this. You've been to Mount St. Helens and you saw the canyons around Mount St. Helens and how those were formed. Right. We've talked a little bit about how Grand Canyon formed and maybe some alternative hypotheses to that. But, you know, here's a small slot canyon. And even with small canyons like this, we think catastrophic processes have made them.
Certainly not processes that we see going on today, or at least the magnitude of those.
That's right. We think, you know, after the flood, as these mountains came up and there was tectonic activity and so forth, that gave good opportunity for these landscapes to be shaped and for, you know, even a small canyon like this to be cut.
But this cutting of this canyon, you're saying it's probably not the floodwaters, it's something else.
That's right. After the flood, certainly there was water that ran off the earth, but there's other opportunities for erosion to occur. As mountains of wet sediment get lifted up, those things can collapse and fail. You can have landslides. As rainwater comes and mixes with sediments, you can have mud flows. In fact, there was a mud flow in this very canyon several decades ago that actually buried some people on a campsite here. And so even today we can see, you know, catastrophes, but in the centuries following the flood especially, I think, there were multiple catastrophes that could have easily shaped canyons like this.
So it's possible maybe an enormous mud flow at least did part of this carving.
Yeah, mud flow, sometimes with just a lot of rain, you get flash floods that pick up a lot of debris and so on, and those kinds of things can cut canyons. I don't know for sure, but it may be that there's a fault in here, and oftentimes faults or just joints in the rock can be a place where erosion can work its magic.
You've mentioned that post-flood era in the first 100, 200, whatever years, that there was a tremendous amount of precipitation.
Yeah.
And so an area like this that doesn't really get a whole lot of rain.
That's right.
It was a drastically different climate at that time.
It was. Just to the north of here in Fossil Basin and Green River Basin, we've looked at the lush landscape that was there, the amount of vegetation that had to grow there, and the water that was there, the fish species that were there, and the birds and so on. And it's much different from the climate that we have here today. So it's very clear, even looking at the rocks around this area, that the climate has changed, that You know, in the past, there probably were some processes that were able to act much more vigorously than they do today because of the climate.
Well, I remember when we were at Mount St. Helens that Dr. Steve Austin was talking about how that basalt was just carved out in a matter of hours simply
Yeah.
by the force of the water.
Right, so one day there was no canyon. They came back the next day and saw a canyon there, and so overnight there was a canyon that had been cut by mud flow. In places it's hundreds of feet deep. And I mean, you go there today and you see a small river flowing through that canyon, and there's a temptation to think, oh, I see this river in the canyon, it must have taken a long time and cut this out little by little. But the truth of the matter is that canyon was cut out, you know, overnight.
Well, in fact, in here, this river, this little
Right.
creek here, comes out of a rock that's in the middle of the canyon.
Yeah, Sheep Creek just starts right up
It
here.
starts right up here.
And there's a temptation to think that this river could cut this canyon somehow, isn't there?
Mm-hmm. But when we think of the massive amount of water flowing through here, it shouldn't be hard then for us to imagine that it can erode a lot of this in the structure that we see.
That's right. We see this in Grand Canyon, we saw it at Mount St. Helens, and we see it here too. That you see these relatively small streams in relatively large valleys or large canyons. Even the biggest river we have in the United States, the Mississippi, even though it's a mile wide in places, it sits in a valley that's 100 miles wide. And we call those underfit streams, underfit valleys, or underfit canyons. And it means that the river flowing through them does not quite match the immense size of the valley of the canyon. And my guess is 90% of the canyons and valleys around the world are underfit. And one of the explanations is that those valleys and canyons were not cut by the streams that currently flow in them, but they were cut by other processes. And so we think that as mountains were lifted up and as erosion started to work on those mountains in the form of flash floods, in the form of mud flows, in the form of glaciation and so on, a lot of those processes could work on canyons like this and enlarge them pretty quickly. And then the stream is there, or the river is there, just as a consequence of the canyon coming first.
So when you say underfit, it means that that river doesn't fit the size of the canyon.
That's right. The river is small compared to the immense
Right.
size of the canyon or the valley that it's in.
And you were mentioning earlier that the Colorado River, for example, going through the Grand Canyon, is really not carving much away. In fact, weren't you saying it was the opposite?
Yeah, it's amazing. I've heard people do this standing on the rim. They're looking out over and they say, look at this big canyon. Just think about how long it would have taken the Colorado River to cut something like this. Look how small the river is down there. But the truth of the matter is the Colorado River is not cutting anything. It's not cutting any depth in the canyon at all today. In fact, the Grand Canyon is getting filled up by debris. So there's mud flows and flash floods and so on that come down the side streams of the Grand Canyon. They dump their load in the Colorado River in the main trunk of the stream, and those boulders sit there for, we know that some have sat there for centuries and not have moved 1 inch. And so there's all kinds of boulders on the bottom of the river that aren't moving. That the river is not cutting the canyon, it's filling up.
And it brings our mind back again to the tremendous amount of forces, the magnitude of those forces that were going on after Noah got off the ark.
That's right.
That really shaped the world around us.
Yeah, so, you know, Psalm 104 talks about the mountains rising up and the valleys sinking down. And we think that that's the process that happened after the flood. The context of Psalm 104 is that those mountains are rising up right after the flood was over. And so these mountains that we're seeing all around the West, they're rising up after the flood is over at the very end. And the landscapes that we're seeing, the mountain ranges that we're seeing, the valleys that we're seeing, all those things have formed since the flood was over.
Yeah, and that cutting force of water, of course we know water cutters or the implements we use to cut rock,
Right.
we use the force of water. And so water, either in its liquid form or the glacier form, has really played a huge part, hasn't it?
I think it has.
In getting us
Yeah.
to the world that we have today.
I think it has, and it's even more amazing when you begin to add rock or sand or other things to that water. It can even have a more powerful effect.
Add an abrasive to that
Yeah,
water.
that's right.
Yeah. John, it seems, at least to me, to say that all the things that carved this canyon out don't seem to be happening today. What's your take?
Yeah, you know, as a geologist, I've looked at a lot of things like this in a lot of different places, and one of the things that I see on some of these canyon walls up here is I see surfaces that aren't fresh. And a lot of times you see like the dark brown or the tan or sometimes the black surface on these rocks.
Does that mean it's been that way for a long time?
Yeah, it's called desert varnish, and that kind of surface accumulates on the face of the rock. And so that what that tells me as a geologist is that surface has been very stable for a long time, that no erosion is happening on that surface at all. And then I see other surfaces that are a little more light colored or whiter, and those are surfaces where you probably have some grains of the rock coming off every year and so on. So those surfaces would be a less stable, and a lot of those surfaces I don't see any plants growing on. But the canyon that's been cut here, and I think that had to happen probably pretty quickly, but then after the canyon gets cut, this entire landscape pretty much just sits here. And that's kind of a principle in geomorphology, is that a landscape goes through major changes catastrophically, maybe like one night at Mount St. Helens, and then the landscape just sits there until the next catastrophe. And you know, I think about the Mississippi River Valley that way. I think about the Grand Canyon that way. And it's probably that way in this canyon as well, that it gets cut catastrophically and then sits dormant for a long time until the next catastrophe comes through.
So this brings our mind back again to what we've been talking about, and that is that exponential drop.
Right.
From the time of the flood being over, and yet the earth still trembling with massive volcanoes and huge earthquakes and all of those things you've mentioned that were shaping and sculpting the earth around us. And then it began to taper off to the smaller shaping that we see today.
It's not that we don't have any catastrophes today. There was a mud flow in this canyon several decades ago that buried some people here in a campground. We saw the mud flow that cut the canyons at Grand Canyon. We've seen rock falls outside of Yellowstone Park, you know, happen during earthquakes. And, you know, we've seen several tsunamis in my lifetime that were, you know, fairly large events that haven't happened not too long ago. And so it's not that we don't have any catastrophes today, but I think the number of catastrophes that we have is declining from the large number of catastrophic events that we would have had as these mountains lifted up.
And the magnitude as well.
That's right, and I think some of those catastrophes were larger in magnitude.
Well, it certainly has left us with a beautiful vista.
It's just stunning in here, isn't it?
It is.